Okay, so as you entered today, you saw that table where it isn't usually, where maybe you barked your hip on it. You're welcome for that. If you saw this and thought, oh, I've already got that, so I don't need it, get up and go get it, because yes, you did. This is the second in a series of three. You recall we're going to have three assignments in this class, and this is number two. It is a darker one than what we did last time. I just want to really briefly introduce this and think with you about what the purpose of this was. So what I'm giving you was given to me. I am teaching you what I was taught. And the class in evangelism and discipleship that I took gave us these three assignments. And the first one was exactly what you did and discussed last week. And by the way, it was such a joy to, kind of hover around and hear the conversations that you guys were having. Because I don't know if you were as blessed by it as I was, but getting to overhear you guys discuss how God has intervened in your life and share with each other seriously, in my ministry life, that was a treasure I will remember for the rest of the time God lets me do this job. So thank you for the investment you put in. And may God use it. Really, it's such a blessing to me to get to hear that. I hope this one is too, although the topic is darker. And what we're going to do in this one is look through what has gone wrong. The gospel is good news in part because we live in a very bad news world. We live in a world that is very troubled. Next week, my lecture or discussion or whatever it turns out to be will actually be focused there. But I want you to do work before I pollute it with hopefully it's a pleasant pollution. But anyway, I wanted you to approach it without me having marked your thinking. So. Just like we did last time, it is the assignment is set up in three parts. Use it as you see fit. It may be that you hear this and think, I don't have to do all that. And if that's you, great, go. But the first, I think 10 pages is a series of questions to help you reflect on how would I talk about this? What is my own thinking about this? How do I understand the concept of the fall, the concept of sin, the concept of evil, and also the idea that we're mortal. Those are things that the good news of the gospel answers as it's good news because this is all pretty hard. We do live in a culture that is increasingly considering the idea of a fall from grace to be irrelevant. The idea that grace exists, that we had a different nature as a race at one time. That the human race, now, there was only two of us, but at one time we were different from what we are, and like radically so. And because we had the grace of God as our primary nature. And then we lost that. We fell from our gracious nature into something else and have become different than we are. Our culture is increasingly offended by that entire idea. The word sin is offensive for a lot of people in our culture, but not everybody. And this is not universal. You can't use any of this but how do I prepare to talk to somebody else about these ideas? Because assuming our faith is true, well, then these ideas are real ideas. So they're going to have evidence beyond what you encounter in Genesis chapter 3. You're going to see in chapters 2 and 3, you're going to see more than just the reality of sin being revealed in the Bible. You're going to see it in our world. And so whether a person believes and accepts your concept of sin or your concept of evil, they're going to have to do something with the data that they're encountering in this universe that story explains. So how do I talk to somebody about that? Does that make sense? So the first 11 pages of this is all questions designed to help you reflect and think on that. And I would encourage you to, spend a day or two answering those with a pen in your hand. Again, we think differently when we have to write things down. When you write something down and articulate it on the page in the written word, your thinking has had to consider how you're going to use your vocabulary to do that, and so your thinking becomes more precise. Well, when you do that, it has a long-term effect on how you think about the topic. It sticks with you. You've thought it through. You know this. And so if you think, well, I already know it, maybe you do. Great, good. But if you write it down, this is why graduate students write papers. And that's why we do it, is because you have to articulate in the written word, and then it kind of marks you and sticks with you. Sure, yeah. Ashley's asking me to ask everybody, does everybody have one of these? I pointed out you walked by the table on your way in, and they're right there. So we can, if you don't have one, you want to raise your hand, we'll get you one. Okay. I say we will. Look, Bill, Bill's doing that. Okay, so when Bill comes back in, raise your hand real high. Bill will bring you one of these. So spend 2 or 3 days thinking on those questions. Then set it aside for a day or two and let your mind cogitate on it. Intentionally don't think about it. And if it comes to your mind, great. Think maybe something. And then when you have given yourself a day or two to go fallow, then write your letter. And remember, your letter is to your editor. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I really do hope you have an editor that you're sending these to. And I'll tell you why. Last week, Kathy observed, it was a very pleasant experience to talk together with someone who is a Christian and already believes like I do. That's a very good experience. And it is, right? That's great. The reason you do this with your editor is because hopefully they don't share your faith experience. They're not already aligned with you. And you get to find out where you're weird. And whether that's a weirdness you need to hang on to because, it's essential to my faith. And so I'll be out of step with my culture. Or whether it's an offensiveness that you don't intend. And yes, sir. Yeah, anybody? Looks like you did not. Well done, good and faithful servant. So then send that off to your editor. I'm curious, those of you who do have editors, so I'm not asking you to out yourself if you don't, but has anyone gotten feedback from your editor? Yeah? How did it go? Excellent. So you had a good experience with an editor. That's wonderful. Did you get any feedback like, I don't get this, what are you talking about? Or boy, that's awful racist or something like that? Not that I think you're racist, but I'm thinking, the kind of objections that are often raised by our culture. Oh, you're part of the patriarchy because you believe. Did you get any sort of feedback like, no, great, good, you choose your friends well. Anybody else? By the way, I'm not going to touch on our book today, but next week I will, and I would encourage you to go ahead and read chapter 3. The first 2 chapters of the Spiritual Conversations book are kind of dark, and they're hard to read. The rest of the book is not. Kathy pointed this out to me as well, that she read chapters 1 and 2, and then she was like, I can't stop there. It's so gross. And so she kept going and read the whole book. And how was it? It's a delight, right? After you get through the bad news of the fact that the church in America has largely stopped having spiritual conversations, or at least the rheostats have turned way down. Once you get through that, the rest of the book, he starts looking at, well, how about those who are having spiritual conversation? And it's really delightful stuff. It's really good from here out. So, because it looks at, okay, well, what are the surprising ideas about what are spiritual conversations? They're way more pleasant than we expect them to be. And things like, okay, well, what are habits I can adopt? What's useful to me that I can actually put into practice to get me actually having these kinds of spiritual conversations with people that need to know that God loves them, and God can really bless their lives. So, okay. Before I get into the handout that I'm, in fact, handout, I'll go ahead and start getting this out. But I want to, while that's going out, do you mind? Thank you. Very good. While that's going out, I want us to think on probably what was one of the most startling statements that was made in the evangelism and discipleship class that I took, that this material is coming from. And it was this. The teacher said, if you plan to plant churches, you rarely get disciples. But if you plan to make disciples, you always get the church. I'll say that again, and then I want us to think on that. What are the implications of that statement? So, if you plan to plant churches, you rarely get disciples. But if you plan to make disciples, you always get the church. What do you think? Is that true? What are the implications of that? What does that mean? What's the difference? What do you think? Let's think on that for just a minute. Okay, talk to me about why. Okay. So the disciples will end up making the church. Okay, very good. It's cart before horse issue. I saw a hand back here, and then I'm not sure. But Greg, what did you? Yeah. Okay. Wow. Everybody hear that? Churches don't go to heaven, people do. Yeah, a church can be like a whole system of programs and plans and ideas and ways of doing things that sometimes can draw an awful lot of energy, and a church can end up feeding that rather than feeding the people, right? But if you keep your focus on the people, um, perhaps those systems serve the people instead of the people serving the systems. Like the man was not made for the Sabbath issue. Remembering that and focusing on those people. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. What Greg said. Yeah, ditto right there. Did I have another one here? I thought I saw, someone behind Greg. No? Anybody else? Yeah, yeah. I've met people who are very, 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 very upset about damage to facilities done by children, for instance, that kind of thing. And it's like, no, you should be grateful for that damage. It means your church has kids. Oh well, now wait a minute. No, I'm just. I was responsible for the change in carpet in a building when I was growing up because the Olympics were out when I was about 7 years old or 6 years old, and I did gymnastics right down the aisle of the church and landed on my face, put my tooth through my lip, and bled all over the carpet. And so we got to buy new carpet because there was a great big Ethan stain and right in the. I was beloved. Anyway. What is a disciple? What do we mean by that? Is that just synonym for Christian? Follower of Jesus. Okay, what does that mean? Why would it result in the church? Why would making disciples result in you getting the church? Because, we started out with, is it possible to be in church and not be a disciple? How so? Okay, so part of being a disciple might be the sharing of the good news with other people. Okay. Serving and loving the others. Okay. Tell me more about that. I think you are very much at the heart of things. I think this is too, but go ahead. Mm, yes, ma'am. Yep, excellent. Yes, ma'am. Hmm. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the wondrous power of God is that He can take the person who sits down long enough in the chicken coop and transform them into that bird. Not that I want to become a chicken. The metaphor breaks down eventually, but that He can In fact, the people who are not practicing discipleship but are attending church are the easiest people to lead into discipleship. Am I right? You know, that is your most likely place to find people and lead them into discipleship is your churchgoers. Probably the next most likely are the people whose lives are really, really, really hurting and chaotic. And the gospel comes as really good news to them that they're beloved of God. Um, those folks may, in some cases, be easier than the person who's been in church their whole life to actually lead into discipleship if they haven't already been practicing it. James did. You know, if you have faith but you don't have obedience, you don't have works of obedience, then your faith is not, mental assent is not the same as the kind of faith that Paul's talking about. Because Paul and James, they don't disagree, right? And Paul will make a big deal about it. It's by grace through faith you've been saved. And James will say if your faith doesn't have works, it's dead. Well, they're talking about the same thing. Real faith is an obedient faith. It's a practice of discipleship. Greg, I saw your hand earlier. Have we talked over have you lost it or do you still got it? Good, share it, please. Yeah. Do you want to do that? Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. The word ecclesia is a government word. People make a big deal out of the etymology of ecclesia. It comes from ek, meaning out, and kaleo, meaning call. So it's the called out. And people make a big deal out of that etymology. I think that's a mistake. You look at the way the word was used in the first century rather than the parts of it and where it came from. The etymology may have something interesting to give us, but the real important thing is that an ecclesia was like Senate. It was a government gathering that said, this is how we're going to do life in this polis, in this city. That's what an ecclesia was. So it was a gathering of the city leaders to get together to say, this is how we will do life here. We're going to structure our life around these priorities. So the ecclesia of Christos, that ecclesia is a government body that comes together to say, this is how we will do life. That's what the church is. It is the gathering of the people to reinforce discipleship. That's what it's for. And it's a government with a king, King Jesus. We are all his disciples, not each other's. We are all his together. And he reigns over us. And then the ecclesia comes together to say, how do we implement his reign here? How do we live out his reign in this place? That's what the church was and perhaps can be. Yes, ma'am. Government. Yeah, so what I think the earliest church was it was a network of ecclesias, just like in the Roman Empire. Okay, the Roman dictates would come out of Rome and they would be the national things, but the real power was implemented through the governors and through the city councils. That's why you ran into so many different kinds of government officials in the book of Acts, like the Asiarchs. Who are they? Government officials that ran this local area. And so the idea of the autonomy of churches of Christ, I think, is actually biblical, but to a point, because that church, I think, did have sort of an international confederacy. They saw themselves as a different nation, and not just totally autonomous at each place, but yeah, if that place is over there as a church, then it's part of our nation. And they saw themselves as this country with a king that was scattered among the nations and that was reaching out to the nations to repatriate people into this real nation, the nation of God. And you come into the nation of God through discipleship to King Jesus. A disciple is someone who lives, read the Sermon on the Mount, and see how alien that way of life is from human life. And then go and try and practice it. Because the word disciple is both student and apprentice. You miss either one of those and you're really kind of missing it, because it's very possible to be a student who doesn't practice. But that's not what a disciple is called to be. And we're called, and as Kathy pointed out, at the heart of Jesus' teaching is this self-giving love, where I practice my life together with you. I have to have another person in my life, because love requires a subject and a predicate, a subject and an object. And we have to both be subject and we have to both be object. So you have to be loved by me, and I have to allow myself to be loved by you. I have to both kneel with the wash basin and the towel, and I have to be willing to sit there through the humiliation of letting you wash my feet. That's discipleship, where we love one another. And to tie into this class and what Harry pointed out at the beginning, evangelism is an act of love. If it's done rightly, evangelism is an act of loving your friend. Because what do you have that's more important in your life than King Jesus? And if you can answer that with anything at all, get rid of it. Just drive it out, sell it, give it away, get rid of it. Because anything that's more important to you than Jesus is misthroned. And if it finds itself within Jesus, good. But if it competes, get it out of there. I'm going to go here and then here, because I saw your hand and then I saw yours. So we'll go to both. And yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And that in spite of the fact that our culture wants us to lose that excitement so bad. I mean, what we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks is the truth that proselytizing is offensive in our culture. Even having a firm belief, a firm faith, is a little offensive in our culture. You can have whatever belief you want as long as the other person gets to say, well, I don't believe like that, but we can, our two truths can coexist. As long as you're there, well, fine. But if you actually believe something, and our culture is in giving offense is the big American sin now. And being offended is the big American virtue. If you're offended, especially if you're offended about the right things, that's virtuous. Just your being offended is virtuous. That is so immature and insane, but that's where our culture is. And so it's dampening that joy. But you're right. I mean, think about this. You were lost. You were saved. Glory to God. You weren't orienting your whole life around self-giving love defined by the cross of Jesus Christ so that you can actually do that. And maybe you have been for 40 or 50 years, but you weren't always. And think of what you might have been and what you are now. Glory to God. It's joyous. You're absolutely right, Helen. You're absolutely right. Harry, I hope you still have your thing, and then we'll move on to the sheet I've handed out. Isn't it great? Mm. Mm. It's very rich, isn't it? And if I may bounce off of that, every human being is a different point in their own life and journey. Also to bounce off what you said earlier, that a disciple is one that shares. I will suggest to you that a disciple is one that loves everybody and shares the moment they can. You know, there is another great nugget I got from class, and I'm just going to share this one. We'll not discuss it. But there is often this idea that, you know what, I will evangelize by my life, and I don't ever have to talk. I heard one of the things that I heard in class is about this actor who is also a mime. So, you know, all that thing. And he was asked, well, which is easier, acting or doing mime? And his answer was, oh, acting is so much easier. Because in acting, you develop a character, and you can do it through facial expression and body stance and all of that, but you also have words. And so words reveal the interior life. You can show what's going on inside of that character by what they say. And so the person is able to relate to that person a whole lot easier. If you do mime, you have to be carrying out your actions so unequivocally, so absolutely precise and clear and obvious that anybody who looks at it immediately knows what it is, right? So the windy day, you know, they are able to say, oh yeah, that's someone walking against the wind, or the person pulling the rope, or the box, whatever. And then they applied this to evangelism, and they said, well, if you want to try to just evangelize by what you do, good. You need to be living that way, or you have no right to talk, right? But if you're never going to talk, then you have to live so unequivocally, so radically Christianly, so much against the grain that there's no doubt what you are. And that might be a useful way of doing evangelism, but what mostly we do in this, I'm going to evangelize without words, is sloppy mime, and nobody knows what we're doing. No, that's right. And I think maybe if you're doing this approach where I won't share the gospel with my lips, I'll share it with my life. Well, the only way that could work is if your love was so radical that you actually fully embraced their life, and it became obvious to that person, okay, this person has to have something I don't. That's the only way that could work. I think you're probably right. I don't know that you can share the gospel without words. The gospel has content. You know, it has intellectual, logical, rational content. I think you're probably right, because even if you didn't provoke it, if you were doing the mime style of evangelism, there would come a point where the other person would go, "What's your deal?" Why are you like this? What is going on? Because you are not like anyone I've ever met. And maybe they've met a lot of Christians. But if you were actually doing this, where you really didn't care about money and give it away all the time, and you really were constantly practicing foot washing, and not literal foot washing, but the act of selfless love where you put yourself constantly in the servant role for these other people, always, that you never put yourself first, ever. It would take that kind of thing to be able to portray Christianity without words. And to do that, I think eventually will provoke the question, what's wrong with you? You weirdo. Ooh, now there's a danger I hadn't thought of. Did everybody hear that? It lifts you up so high in everybody else's eyes that you forget about Jesus. Forget why you're doing this. Because everybody loves the servant. Oh, man. Okay, let me really briefly move to this. We've got only about 3 minutes, so I'll let you take this home as homework, I suppose. But I do want to just briefly introduce this. And actually, before I do this, let me give you a bonus assignment if you want to do it. Okay, this is extra credit. You're not getting graded, so I don't know why you want. Why does she do this? Siri has decided to interrupt all of my preaching and lectures. Why is she doing this? I need to turn down the sensitivity of my watch. She is, that's right. She's really going out of her way to mime irritating device. Okay, bonus thing. I've been preaching here about 10 years. It'll be 10 years in August, so 9.5 years. And I would just love it if you've, whether you've been with me that long or not, this is the assignment. What is the gospel that I preach? What do you... I don't... Yeah, I would too. I would love to. Maybe she did like a quick summary of 9 years of YouTubes. Here's your main points. And just real quickly, that's not necessarily the gospel as it ought to be preached. If you disagree with me, okay, that actually might even be useful to me. But I would love, and think of it in terms of maybe a paragraph, perhaps two. What do you hear in my sermons that is good news? What is the gospel? The way that I preach it. And you might also do, okay, and here's a paragraph that says, what is the gospel as I understand it? Bonus in this class. Okay? All right, really quickly, I just want to point out that a spiritual conversation is a conversation. In this class, I am preparing you with 3 big points that have evangelistic outreach value, right? So your own testimony, your own witness, we don't use that word, but your own God story, how God intervened in your life and the gospel as it is passed through you. Why do you believe it? Why is it important to you? Why is it significant? That has evangelistic outreach value. The second is what's gone wrong. Okay? I don't know that people have to believe in hell in order to become Christians. Christ can lead those who don't believe in hell to believe in hell if he's interested in doing that. I think he will, because he talks about it more than anyone else. It doesn't necessarily have to be our starting point, though. Our starting point is Jesus. Jesus is the attractive thing about the gospel. But understanding the concept of what is troubled in human life, our starting point, and where does discipleship help us leave, that's significant. And then what does a reformed and renewed way of life look like? Those 3 things I'm preparing you with so that you're ready to talk about them. But it is important to note, we have got a bad model of evangelism that has been kind of led to us in America that is in part the result of the separation of church and state. And that's a real big thing to us. We're glad not to have the state oppress us. But what that generated was a whole bunch of denominational competition and a marketplace for competing gospels. And what that resulted in over the last 200 years is that that evangelism has largely become a kind of sales technique, trying to convince people to believe in our church's ideas so that you'll come to our church and move this organization forward. And that's what it's about. It's about getting people into your club. And so do whatever you got to do to get them here. After all, it's their salvation. It's their eternity. Evangelism as a sales technique is problematic to its core. It usually involves a kind of bait and switch where you talk about all the great stuff that Jesus has to offer, and it generally reduces discipleship as an important part of the salvation process. It pushes it out. Because those are expectations. You know, and what I want to focus on is the benefits, because I want to sell you the car. Okay? That is not healthy evangelism. Convincing people by my arguments to buy a product, and the product is Jesus, and it's hell insurance. That's problematic to its core. Real evangelism is an act of love. Real evangelism is where you have a friend and you're willing to talk to them about ultimate reality. You know, you're willing to enter into way beyond the weather and go deep. Okay, let me just really briefly run through what's on this page, because, I mean, look, you're not, 4-year-olds, so it's not that you need to be taught, now here's how you have a conversation. I'm not trying to do that. But these were given to me, and I thought they were useful for my thinking about, okay, how do I love people? Because each of these different points are useful ways to behave with somebody else that results in love. Okay? The first is this, just come into relationship with me. Come in points. Come be a friend of mine. And it's where you talk about the game or the weather or politics or, whatever. The shallow topics that don't really threaten and don't really mean a lot, but that everybody's talking about. The Avengers movie. Whatever. It's why, by the way, having a life where you do stuff like that is useful. It's a contact point. You're inviting them to come into your life and you're coming into theirs. You're just being friendly. At the next level, you have what they called plug-in points. And, okay, the examples I've given you almost sound like one-upmanship. It is not that, if it's actually really done. But what you're looking for is points where your story intersects with theirs. And you can share heart, right? So if I've got somebody in my life who was raised by an alcoholic, bam, I can share that with them. And that doesn't mean that I had their experiences. I don't mean that. And it doesn't mean, well, your experience was bad. Let me tell you about mine. It doesn't mean that. It means you and I, we can walk together in this. And so you look for places where we have common ground. Where our lives overlap and we can get close to one another. Take on points. This is after you've established a relationship, and it's where you're willing to push a different idea than what is already in their head. The example that he gave to us in class, really great. Have you ever heard of the parable of the elephant, where 5 blind men approach an elephant, and one of them will say, it is like a wall, and another will say, it is like a pillar, and another will say, it is like a snake, and another, you've heard this parable before, right? And what the parable ends up being is, well, all of the religions are teaching about the same God, but they're doing it because the people have had different contact points with God. And what this friend shared with their friend is, can I point out a flaw in that parable? Because what they're approaching has got to be a statue of an elephant. Because if you approach a living elephant and you put your hands all over it, it will kill you. Because a living elephant is something that moves around. It doesn't stay static. And it doesn't let you grope its trunk. So, your idea, the parable falls apart in that it doesn't actually interact with God as he actually is. This analogy's got a weak point, and that opened up a discussion for that probed at pluralism, and eventually pluralism collapsed in his friend. Okay, well that started because they were willing to offer challenge. The next 2 points are on the other side of the page, and these are both points where you are working. You've got a friendship that you're like, okay, this person actually might become interested in discipleship. So you've got a point where you're saying, okay, how do I move the conversation on to what I believe is really important? That would be what he calls take-off points. And then decide 2 points are invitation. And one of the things that this teacher pointed out was, it's amazing how often Christians will work with somebody for years and never get to the point where they say, would you like to study the Bible with me? Or would you be interested in coming to church? Or do you want to take on Christ in baptism? You seem really interested in him. Do you want to become a disciple? And the coming to that point that's kind of the greatest act of love. It's not about sealing the deal. It's about being brave enough to invite someone to come with us as we go with Christ. And then really, really quickly, those 4 important principles are all love principles. Listen more, talk less, ask questions, be interested in the answers. People will share their heart with you if you get to this point. And so ask them, tell me about your childhood. What was faith like in your childhood? And what was your family's approach to God? And how do you think that affected you? Those kinds of questions. And then actually being interested in the answers, because you don't have a right to sell the gospel to someone you don't care about. But you do have the right to invite someone to love Jesus if you love them. Okay, so, oh goodness, I've gone way long. So let's get ready to worship God, and may God bless our conversations.